Dr. Alan Frost stood in the brightly lit underground lab, his heart pounding with anticipation. Years of research, countless failed experiments, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. Around him, a team of scientists and government officials watched in silent expectation. The Serum, his life's work, was finally ready for its ultimate test. Rows of monitors displayed real-time data from previous trials. On mice, the Serum had shown perfect results. Their minds became entirely submissive, their instincts overridden with absolute obedience. When tested on primates, it worked even better. The test subjects followed commands without hesitation, their free will erased in an instant. Now, with the data proving undeniable success, the government had given the green light for human trials. The subject sat in the sealed glass chamber, strapped to a chair, his eyes darting around the sterile white room. He was a volunteer, a convicted criminal with no family, no future, and no choice. His file labeled him as Michael Carter, age 32, former Special Forces. He had agreed to the experiment in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the truth was, he had no idea what he was about to experience. Dr. Frost adjusted his glasses and nodded to his assistant. A mechanical hiss filled the room as the serum was injected into the subject's bloodstream through an automated syringe. The response was almost immediate. Carter stiffened, his muscles tensing as if frozen in time. His breathing grew shallow, his pupils dilated, and for a moment, it seemed as if his body was shutting down. The scientists held their breath. Then, suddenly, Carter's body relaxed. His eyes blinked rapidly before settling into a glassy, vacant stare. Dr. Frost leaned forward and spoke into the microphone. "Michael Carter, can you hear me?" "Yes," came the monotone reply. A ripple of excitement spread through the room. It was working. "Stand up," Frost commanded. Carter obeyed instantly, rising from his chair in a smooth mechanical motion. There was no hesitation, no resistance. "Raise your right hand." Carter complied. A murmur of approval passed among the government officials. The project was a success. Years of research had finally paid off. Humanity had just gained the ability to control minds with absolute precision. Wars could be won without bloodshed. Criminals could be reformed without prisons. The possibilities were limitless. Dr. Frost exhaled, his hands trembling slightly with excitement. This was it. This was the moment that would change history. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "take 3 steps forward." Carter did as he was told. Then he stopped. A flicker of something crossed his face, something that shouldn't have been there. His blank expression shifted, ever so slightly, into a frown. His eyes, once empty, now burned with awareness. "Michael?" Dr. Frost asked, his voice uncertain. Carter lifted his head. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his gaze to the observation window where Frost and his team stood. The silence in the lab became deafening. "I can hear you," Carter said again, but this time, his voice was different. It was no longer lifeless. It was sharp, cold, amused. Frost's stomach clenched. Something was wrong. The monitors behind him flickered wildly. Heart rate, brain activity. Every reading had skyrocketed beyond normal human levels. The serum was supposed to erase free will. It was supposed to make Carter compliant. But the numbers on the screen told a different story. Instead of suppressing his mind, the serum had done something else entirely. It had set it free. A slow smile spread across Carter's face. He raised his hand, but this time, it wasn't in obedience. It was a test, a realization of his own control. The man who was supposed to be their puppet was no longer following orders. The observation window rattled as Carter stepped closer, his movements no longer mechanical but fluid, confident. Frost felt his breath quicken. "Security," he whispered. "Lock the chamber." Too late. The lights flickered. A sharp, high-pitched sound rang through the lab. Carter tilted his head, listening. Then, with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, he clenched his fists and shattered his restraints like they were made of paper. Alarms blared. Scientists scrambled. Dr. Frost didn't move. He couldn't. He just stared at the man inside the chamber, the man who should have been under control. Instead, Carter looked directly at him and smiled. "Thank you, Doctor," he said softly. "I think I'll take it from here." The alarm screamed through the lab, a shrill, piercing sound that sent waves of panic through the team. Scientists scrambled to their stations, security officers rushed to the containment room, and red emergency lights bathed the walls in a chaotic glow. The mind control serum had worked, just not in the way anyone had expected. Dr. Alan Frost stood frozen in place, his hands gripping the edge of the control panel. His mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. Carter was supposed to be a mindless, obedient soldier, but instead he was awake, more awake than anyone should be. And now he was loose. Inside the chamber, Michael Carter flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a heavy weight. His head tilted slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the scientists beyond the thick glass, noting their expressions of fear, their frantic movements. He could hear every rapid heartbeat, sensed the rising panic in the air. It was intoxicating. His mind had never felt clearer, his body never more alive. With a single step forward, he placed his palm against the glass, pressing just enough to feel its cold resistance. He smiled. "Lock it down." One of the guards barked, slamming a button on the wall. Thick steel shutters began descending over the chamber's glass walls, sealing Carter inside. For a second, everything was still. Then, Carter moved. He struck the glass with his fist, and the entire chamber shuddered. Cracks spiderwebbed out from the point of impact, and the reinforced material groaned under the pressure. The scientists gasped, stepping back in disbelief. That glass was built to withstand explosions. Carter hit it again, harder. The cracks spread like lightning bolts. Dr. Frost's heart pounded. "That's impossible," he whispered. The guards inside the lab lifted their weapons, training them on the chamber. Carter took one more step back, exhaled, and then lunged. The glass exploded outward in a shower of jagged shards, sending security officers diving for cover. Before anyone could react, Carter was already moving. Faster than any human should be able to, he closed the distance to the nearest guard in an instant. With a fluid motion, he twisted the rifle from the man's grip, turned, and slammed the butt of the weapon into the second guard's face. Blood sprayed across the cold white floor. The remaining officers opened fire. Bullets tore through the air, but Carter was no longer where they expected him to be. He ducked, weaved, and then, impossibly, caught one of the bullets midair between his fingers. He turned it over, studying it with amusement, then flicked it aside like a piece of dust. The gunfire stopped. The officers hesitated, exchanging terrified glances. Carter grinned. "Not fast enough," he murmured. In a blur of motion, he tore through them. Bones snapped, bodies crumpled, and within seconds, the entire security team lay motionless on the floor. Dr. Frost felt like the air had been sucked from the room. He had designed this serum. He had understood every chemical, every neural reaction. He had known exactly what it was supposed to do. And yet this was something else entirely. Carter wasn't just resisting control. He was something new. More alarms blared. Emergency lockdown protocols engaged, sealing every exit with thick steel barriers. Carter turned his head toward the sound, his expression shifting from amusement to calculation. He was trapped. Or at least, that's what they thought. Frost watched in horror as Carter closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then the screens around the lab flickered, lines of strange, unreadable code running across them. A second later, the entire facility's power grid flickered. The lights dimmed. The security doors twitched, and then silence. A low chuckle escaped Carter's lips. Dr. Frost's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't just physically enhanced. His mind had evolved too. He had already figured out how to manipulate the systems around him, as if his brain was working at a speed beyond human comprehension. The emergency lights flickered back on. The steel doors that had been meant to contain him hissed open. Carter turned toward the exit. Containment failed. One of the scientists whispered in disbelief. "No," Frost murmured, his eyes locked onto Carter's retreating form. Control failed. Carter stepped through the open doorway without urgency, without fear. He had no need to run. There was no one left who could stop him. The so-called perfect mind control serum had worked, just not in the way anyone had expected. It had freed his mind completely. And now, he was walking out into the world, no longer a prisoner, but a man with power beyond anything humanity had ever known. The facility lay in ruins, red warning lights flickering uselessly against the cold metal walls. Bodies of security personnel littered the floor, their weapons scattered like discarded toys. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of flickering monitors and the faint crackling of exposed wiring. Michael Carter stepped over the fallen guards with the eerie calm of a man who had nothing to fear. His movements were deliberate, his posture relaxed. He could hear the distant echoes of frantic voices deeper in the facility, scientists scrambling for safety, security teams shouting orders into radios that no longer worked. They thought they could stop him. They still believed they had control. They were wrong. Dr. Alan Frost remained frozen at his station, staring at the security feed. Every camera in the facility was flickering between static and brief glimpses of Carter's path through the corridors. Somehow, he was manipulating the very systems meant to contain him. But how? The serum was designed to suppress independent thought, to override resistance. It was supposed to turn men into obedient tools of the government. Instead, it had turned Carter into something else entirely. Frost swallowed hard, forcing his shaking fingers to type commands into his terminal. Emergency lockdown sequences failed one after another. The blast doors meant to seal off the upper levels were opening instead of closing. The power grid fluctuated wildly, as if the entire system were no longer responding to human input. It was responding to Carter. A sharp beep from his earpiece snapped Frost out of his daze. It was Colonel Briggs, the government official overseeing the project. His voice came through, clipped and tense. "Frost. Report." Frost hesitated. He wanted to say that everything was under control, that the serum was working as expected. But the truth was evident in the bodies on the floor, in the chaos unfolding on the screens before him. "It's worse than we thought," Frost admitted. "The serum didn't make him obedient. It made him something else. Faster, stronger, smarter. He's already past the lower levels. And I think he's—" The security feed cut out completely. Frost's heart skipped a beat. Carter had reached the control center. The heavy steel doors at the end of the hallway slid open with a soft hiss, and Carter stepped inside. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the blinking screens, the panicked scientists, the rows of failed emergency commands flashing red. He met Frost's wide-eyed stare and smiled. "Doctor," Carter said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "We need to talk." Frost took an involuntary step back. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. "You?" He swallowed. "You should be under control." Carter tilted his head. "I was." He took a slow step forward, for about 10 seconds, and then I woke up. The remaining security guards in the room raised their weapons. "Hands up," one of them shouted. Carter sighed, almost disappointed. "You really don't want to do that." The first guard pulled the trigger. The muzzle flashed, and Carter was gone. Before the bullet even reached where he had stood, he had moved. 1 second, he was standing in front of them. The next, he was behind them. A blur of motion, faster than human eyes could track. Frost barely processed what happened next. A flicker of movement, a cry of pain, the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. In less than 3 seconds, every guard in the room lay unconscious or worse. Carter turned back to Frost. "You don't seem like the fighting type, Doctor," he said. "So let's have a conversation instead." Frost's breath came in short, panicked bursts. "What do you want?" Carter considered the question. His eyes flicked to the screens, scanning the countless classified files Frost had been working on. After a moment, he reached out and placed a single hand on the terminal. The entire system flickered. A rapid cascade of code scrolled across the screen, too fast for any human to process. Frost could only watch, stunned, as encrypted files unlocked one after another. Project documents, classified government operations, military secrets. Carter was absorbing everything. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The screens went dark. Carter pulled his hand away and exhaled slowly. "I think I understand now," he murmured. Frost clenched his fists. "Understand what?" Carter's gaze met his, and for the first time, Frost saw something that chilled him to the core: pity. Why they wanted this serum in the first place, Carter said. Why they were so desperate to control minds. Because they knew what would happen if people started thinking for themselves. A silence stretched between them. Carter turned toward the exit. "This was never about obedience," he continued. "It was about fear. They're afraid of what people could become if they weren't shackled, if they weren't controlled." He paused. "And I understand why. Because now, I'm free." Frost's stomach twisted. He had spent years perfecting the serum, believing he was making the world safer. But now, faced with Carter, something beyond human, beyond control, he realized the horrifying truth. He had created something unstoppable. Carter glanced back one last time. "You might want to get out of here, Doctor. This facility isn't going to be standing much longer." Then, without another word, he was gone. Frost collapsed into his chair, his mind reeling. On the darkened screens before him, the last remaining data logs flashed one final warning. 380 Louisville. Unknown. Containment impossible. Somewhere above, distant explosions rumbled through the structure. The facility was falling apart, and Michael Carter was walking out into the world. Free, powerful, and with a mind no one could ever control again. The sky above the hidden facility was dark, thick storm clouds swirling as if the world itself knew something had gone terribly wrong. A cold wind howled through the dense forest surrounding the underground compound, carrying the distant echoes of sirens and explosions. Michael Carter stepped out of the shattered security gate and into the open world, inhaling deeply. The scent of rain, earth, and freedom filled his lungs. For the first time in years, he was no longer a prisoner of a system, of a government, or even of his own mind. He flexed his fingers, still adjusting to the overwhelming clarity in his thoughts. His mind processed information at an impossible speed, his senses sharper than any human's should be. He had spent his entire life being told what to do. First as a soldier, following orders without question. Then as a prisoner, bound by rules he had no power to change. And finally, as a test subject, reduced to nothing more than an experiment. Now he was something else entirely. The facility behind him was collapsing, flames licking at its edges, smoke rising into the night sky. He could still hear the panicked voices of scientists and security personnel scrambling to escape, but their fate no longer concerned him. He had bigger questions to answer. What was he now? And what would he do with the power he had been given? A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath him. Helicopters. The government wouldn't let him walk away so easily. He turned his head slightly, listening. 5 aircraft, fast-moving, inbound from the north. They would be here in less than 2 minutes. He smiled. They still thought they could stop him. Miles away, inside one of the approaching helicopters, Colonel Briggs sat with a hardened expression, staring at the tablet screen in his lap. Satellite footage displayed the burning remains of the facility, a stark reminder of the disaster unfolding in real time. Frost's panicked voice had been the last transmission they received before the entire system went dark. The facility's mainframe had been compromised, and all data related to Project Obedience was gone. Wiped clean. Not stolen. Erased. Carter had done that. The soldier who was supposed to be their perfect, mindless weapon had become something else, something no one could explain. "Sir," a voice crackled through his earpiece, "we have visual on the target." Briggs lifted his gaze to the window just in time to see him, standing alone on the charred ground, looking up at them like he had been expecting them all along. "Deploy strike team," Briggs ordered. "Engage on sight. Do not." His voice caught in his throat as Carter lifted a single hand, palm open. The helicopter jerked violently, alarms screaming as the controls became unresponsive. The pilot swore, yanking the joystick, but the aircraft wasn't obeying. None of them were. "Something's wrong. Losing control," another pilot shouted through the comms. Briggs could only watch in horror as the 5 helicopters, one by one, turned in midair against the will of their pilots. Their engines screamed as they fought against some unseen force, but it was useless. The aircraft began descending, slowly at first, then faster. Carter hadn't moved. He simply watched, his fingers twitching slightly, as if playing with invisible strings. Briggs clenched his fists. This isn't possible. But it was. The helicopters shuddered, their rotors whining as they were forced into a slow, controlled landing. Not a single one crashed. Not a single person was harmed. But they were grounded, helpless. And Carter had done it with nothing but a thought. The moment the aircraft touched down, their engines cut off. Complete silence followed. Briggs swallowed hard. He had commanded some of the deadliest operations in history. He had seen war in its purest, bloodiest form. But never, not once, had he felt the kind of fear crawling through his spine now. Carter walked toward them. Slowly, confidently. Briggs' men poured out of the helicopters, rifles raised. But no one fired. No one dared. Carter stopped a few feet away. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. Briggs stepped forward. He had no choice. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Stand down, and no one has to get hurt." Carter smiled, just a slight, knowing curve of his lips. "That's the difference between us, Colonel," he said. "I don't take orders anymore." Briggs held his ground. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Carter's expression didn't change. "I've woken up. You killed good men back there," Briggs said coldly. "They were following orders, just like you used to." Carter tilted his head. "And that's the problem, isn't it? People always following orders, never questioning, never thinking." He let out a slow breath. "That's what your serum was for, wasn't it? To make sure no one ever questioned again." Briggs didn't respond. Carter took a step closer. "Tell me, Colonel, if that serum had worked the way you wanted, what would you have done with it?" Briggs clenched his jaw. "Kept the world safe." Carter's eyes darkened. "Safe for who?" Silence. Carter looked at the soldiers surrounding him, their fingers twitching on their triggers. He could hear their heartbeats, the subtle tremor in their breath. They were afraid. And he understood why. He had become something beyond their comprehension, something they couldn't control. He turned his gaze back to Briggs. "You're afraid of me, of what I might do." Briggs met his stare. "Shouldn't I be?" Carter considered that for a moment. Then he smiled again, but there was something different in it this time. Something almost amused. "You don't have to be," he said. "I'm not your enemy. But if you try to put me back in a cage." He let his words hang in the air, the unspoken warning clear. Briggs exhaled sharply. He knew the truth. If Carter wanted them dead, they'd be dead. If he wanted to disappear, he would. The government had spent billions trying to create the perfect soldier, the ultimate weapon. Instead, they had created something they could never control. Carter stepped back. "Tell them," he said. "Tell your people that Project Obedience is over, that I'm not coming back." Briggs didn't move. Carter turned, walking past the grounded helicopters, past the stunned soldiers, disappearing into the dark forest beyond. He didn't need to run. He had nothing to fear. Briggs watched him go, his hands clenched into fists. The world had just changed forever, and no one, not the government, not the military, was ready for what came next. The city stretched before Michael Carter like an ocean of lights, each flickering window a tiny glimpse into lives untouched by the horrors he had escaped. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the pale glow of street lamps. Cars rolled by in steady waves, their drivers unaware of the man standing atop the abandoned rooftop, watching them. Carter had walked for miles through the forest, through quiet highways and empty roads, until civilization finally revealed itself. The government would be searching for him, but they wouldn't find him. Not yet. He was faster, smarter, and more aware of their tactics than they could ever imagine. They wanted him back in a cage. That would never happen. He had spent his time since escaping the facility testing the limits of his abilities. His mind was unlike anything he had ever known. He could hear the faint hum of electricity running through the city's power grid. He could feel the electromagnetic pulses of nearby communication towers, feeding endless streams of data into the world. If he concentrated, he could even sense the signals in the air: calls, messages, encrypted government communications. The world spoke in whispers of information, and he was learning how to listen. A sharp pain stabbed through his temple. Carter flinched, gripping the rusted railing beside him. Every time he pushed too far, the overload hit him like a hammer to the skull. His body wasn't struggling to keep up, but his mind, his consciousness, was adjusting to something far beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just intelligence. It was something deeper, something more. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself. He had a plan to figure out. Across the street, neon signs buzzed above a small diner. The smell of coffee and fried food drifted through the air. It was quiet, nearly empty at this hour. A perfect place to sit, to think, to observe. Carter moved like a shadow, slipping down the fire escape and onto the street below. He adjusted the stolen jacket he had taken from an abandoned truck along the highway, pulled the hood over his face, and crossed the street. Inside, the diner was warm, the hum of an old jukebox filling the space with soft music. A single waitress, a woman in her late 30s with tired eyes, leaned against the counter, flipping through a newspaper. A man in the farthest booth stirred a cup of coffee absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on something unseen. Carter slid into a booth near the window, his back against the wall. The waitress glanced up. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee," Carter said. His voice was steady, but softer than usual. He wasn't afraid of being recognized. No one knew his face. Not yet, but he was cautious. The woman nodded, pouring a cup from the pot behind the counter before setting it in front of him. "Rough night." Carter gave a small smile. "Something like that." She studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Well, coffee's hot. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, Carter wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The simple act of sitting in a normal place, surrounded by normal people, was almost surreal. For years, he had been nothing more than a weapon in development. Now he was free. But freedom came with questions, ones he wasn't sure he could answer. What was he supposed to do now? He wasn't just another man. He wasn't even a soldier anymore. He was something else entirely. The government had turned him into a living experiment, and if they couldn't control him, they would try to destroy him. He needed to know what they were planning. His mind reached out, sifting through invisible streams of data, searching for anything that could lead him back to the people who had created Project Obedience. Names, locations, plans. Static filled his head, a jumbled mess of noise and code. Then clarity, a voice. Uncontained. Subject is highly dangerous. Last known coordinates. Carter flinched. His vision blurred as he latched onto the signal, pulling it closer. He could hear them. Search perimeter extended. Orders remain the same. Capture alive if possible. Lethal force authorized if necessary. Carter exhaled through his nose. He had expected this. What he didn't expect was the next voice. "He's different, Colonel. More than we predicted. We need to reconsider the approach." "No. We finish what we started. We end this before it gets worse." "Briggs." The colonel wasn't giving up. Carter smirked to himself, taking a slow sip of coffee. He had always respected Briggs as a soldier. The man followed orders, always did what needed to be done. But this time, he was making a mistake. Because Michael Carter wasn't running. He was hunting. His fingers tapped lightly against the table as his mind sorted through the data he had pulled. There. A government safe house, not far from the city. He could see the coordinates in his mind like they had been burned into his memory. That was where they were regrouping, where Briggs would be, and where Carter would get his answers. He placed a few bills on the table, stolen from the same truck as the jacket, and stood. The waitress barely glanced at him as he left, and the man in the farthest booth didn't look up. Outside, the air was crisp. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, a web of streets and alleyways that would soon be crawling with men looking for him. He pulled his hood lower and walked into the night, his path already set. The government wanted their perfect soldier back. They were about to learn just how big of a mistake they had made. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that existed only before a storm. The city lights faded behind Michael Carter as he moved through the empty industrial zone, his pace steady, his focus sharp. The safe house was close. Hidden among abandoned warehouses and forgotten buildings, it was the perfect place for the government to regroup without drawing attention. Carter had seen its location in the data he had intercepted. He knew the structure, the security protocols, the number of operatives stationed there. They thought they were prepared. They weren't. A chain-link fence surrounded the compound, topped with razor wire. Security cameras rotated on their mounts, scanning for intruders. A single checkpoint controlled access, manned by 2 guards in black tactical gear. They carried rifles, their stances relaxed but professional. Carter crouched behind a rusted dumpster, watching. He could take them out quickly, but that wasn't his plan. He didn't need brute force. He had something far more effective. Closing his eyes, he reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind. The world around him shifted, the hum of electronic signals filling his thoughts. He felt the cameras, their circuits pulsing with data. He felt the radios on the guards' belts, the security system buried beneath layers of encryption. He didn't need to break in physically. He could walk right in. With a flicker of thought, the security feed looped, showing an empty fence line. The cameras were blind. The guards' radios crackled with static. Their signals scrambled. They didn't even notice. Carter stood and walked forward. The guards didn't react as he approached. Their eyes momentarily glazed over. He had slipped into their thoughts, not controlling them, just nudging. A small suggestion, a whisper in their subconscious. "You don't see anything." He walked past them, stepping into the compound. Inside, the safe house was exactly as he had seen in the data, a reinforced bunker disguised as an old warehouse. A single entrance, a loading dock repurposed into a secure checkpoint. Armed personnel patrolled the interior, their movements precise. They were expecting an attack, but not like this. Carter moved through the halls unseen, his presence slipping past their awareness like a shadow in the corner of their vision. He wasn't invisible, he was just unimportant. Their minds registered him, but only as background noise, a figure that didn't require attention. He made his way toward the command center. That's where Briggs would be. That's where the real answers were. A locked door stood before him, secured by a biometric scanner. A normal intruder would need a stolen ID, a severed hand, or an entire hacking team to get through. Carter just placed his fingers on the scanner. It beeped green. The door slid open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with monitors displaying satellite feeds, surveillance footage, and classified reports. Military personnel worked at terminals, their screens flashing urgent messages. The air was thick with tension. At the center of it all stood Colonel Briggs. Carter stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind him. The soft hiss made everyone in the room turn. Briggs locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Briggs exhaled. "Everyone out," he said. The officers hesitated, glancing at one another. "Now," Briggs repeated. One by one, they filed out, their movements stiff, uncertain. When the last of them was gone, the doors sealed shut again, leaving only Carter and Briggs. The colonel crossed his arms. "You've been busy." Carter tilted his head. "So have you." Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. "I should put a bullet in you right now." "You could try." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. "You wiped the project," Briggs finally said. "Deleted every file. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Carter stepped closer. "I ended it." Briggs' jaw tightened. "You don't understand." Carter scoffed. "No, Colonel, you don't understand. You tried to turn me into a machine. You wanted obedience, control. We wanted protection." Briggs snapped. "We wanted a force capable of keeping order in a world that's spiraling into chaos. You think this was just about control? It was about survival." "Whose survival?" Carter asked. "Because it sure as hell wasn't mine." Briggs said nothing. Carter took another step forward. "You wanted soldiers who wouldn't hesitate, who wouldn't question orders. You wanted perfect weapons. But humans aren't weapons. We think. We feel. You can't just program us." Briggs' eyes darkened. "And what are you now?" Carter hesitated. He knew the answer, but saying it out loud made it real. "I'm something you can't control." Briggs sighed. "You're not the only one, you know." Carter frowned. "What?" Briggs reached for a file on the desk, sliding it across. Carter picked it up. Flipping it open, his stomach tightened. Photos, reports, names, other test subjects. "Project Obedience was never just about you," Briggs said. "There were others. Some were terminated when they failed. Some disappeared." Carter's fingers clenched around the pages. "You're not the only one out there, Carter," Briggs continued. "And not all of them are as stable as you." Carter looked up, his mind racing. He had assumed he was the only one to survive, that he was the final product, the ultimate creation. But if there were others? "What are you saying?" Carter asked. Briggs leaned forward. "I'm saying you're a problem, Carter. But you're not the biggest one. There are others out there who are stronger, more unstable. And if you think the government was dangerous when they were trying to control you, wait until you see what they'll do to contain them." Carter's jaw tightened. He had spent so much time focused on his own survival that he hadn't considered what came next. Now he knew. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air inside the command center felt heavier now. Michael Carter could hear the low hum of monitors, the faint tapping of a distant keyboard. But none of that mattered. His mind was locked on the file in his hands. The names, the faces, the classified reports detailing others like him. He wasn't the only one. Colonel Briggs watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. The man was a strategist, always thinking 10 steps ahead. But right now, even he looked uncertain. Carter slowly closed the file, his fingers tightening around the edges. "Where are they?" Briggs exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "Scattered. Some are dead. Some are missing. And some," he hesitated, "some have already turned against us." Carter felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Turned against you, or turned against everyone?" Briggs didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the desk, his voice low. "You were different, Carter. The serum enhanced you, but it didn't break you. That wasn't the case for the others." Carter already knew what he meant. He had felt it himself, the overwhelming rush of power, the constant battle to keep his thoughts his own. If the others hadn't been as lucky. "How bad?" Carter asked. Briggs's gaze hardened. "One of them, the one we're most concerned about, goes by the name Mendez. You might remember him. Same batch of trials as you. Carter's mind flashed back. Mendez. He did remember him. A soldier, just like Carter, but with a temper that never quite cooled. The doctors had always monitored him more closely. They worried about him losing control. Last intel put him in Chicago. Briggs continued. 3 days ago, an entire Black Ops team went after him. They never came back. Carter clenched his jaw. He knew what that meant. Briggs crossed his arms. We designed you to be better than human. A bar fight. Reports of a man taking down 5 people on his own. No weapons. No hesitation. It was him. Carter's pulse quickened. He moved, leaping effortlessly from one rooftop to another, his body a blur of motion. The city blurred past him, and within minutes he was there. The bar was wrecked. Broken tables, shattered glass, unconscious bodies sprawled across the floor, and in the center of it all stood Mendez. He looked different. Taller, broader, his muscles unnaturally defined. His posture too controlled. His dark eyes locked onto Carter the second he entered. A slow smile crept onto Mendez's face. I was wondering when you'd show up. Carter stepped forward. You made a lot of noise. Mendez chuckled. Had to get your attention somehow. For a moment, they just stood there, staring each other down. 2 soldiers, 2 experiments, face to face for the first time since the facility. Then Mendez tilted his head. They sent you to stop me, didn't they? Carter didn't answer. Mendez smirked. You can feel it, can't you? The power. The way it changes you. The way it makes everything else seem so small. Carter's jaw tightened. Mendez took a slow step forward. They want you to fight me. To kill me. But you don't have to. You understand what we are now. We don't have to play by their rules anymore. Carter shook his head. This isn't about rules. It's about what happens if you don't stop. Mendez's smirk widened. Then let's find out. And then he moved. Faster than a bullet, faster than thought. Carter barely had time to react before Mendez was on him, a fist crashing toward his skull. Carter dodged, the air whistling past his ear. He struck back, but Mendez caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting with unnatural strength. Carter gritted his teeth. This wasn't a fight between men. It was a clash between something more. Something monstrous. They crashed through the wall, landing in the street below, cars screeching to a halt around them. Mendez grinned, his eyes burning with something wild. Come on, Carter. Show me what you really are. Carter exhaled, rolling his shoulders. This was it. The fight that would decide everything. And he wasn't about to lose.